So this presentation is about China anxiety. There's lots of woes after the last election and the results, but one of the woes will be, we hope, for the government to actually deal with the real situation. China and the huge standoff now taking place between the USA and China is a problem that's involved Australia. Hardly a day goes by without a significant writer saying Australia's policy towards China is a mess, a problem, a challenge. That is what we want to discuss tonight, Australia, China and the USA. And I'm going to ask you to turn your mobile phones off. I've already turned my Huawei phone off. My Huawei phone that is minus Google Play. It disappeared a month ago. So I'd like to introduce the speaker, Hugh White. He's a specialist in Australian foreign and defence policy and a critical voice on the unfolding tension with China. He's now Emeritus Professor in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. His work focuses primarily on Australian strategic and defence policy, Asia-Pacific security issues and global strategy affairs, especially as they influence Australia in the Asia-Pacific, which actually is where we're located, not in Europe, not in the US. He has served as an intelligence analyst with the Office of National Assessments, as a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald, and as a senior advisor on the staffs of Defence Minister Kim Beazley and Prime Minister Bob Hawke, the good credentials. And as a senior official in the Department of Defence, where from 1995 to 2000, he is Deputy Secretary for Strategic and Intelligence, and as the first director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI. In the 1970s, he studied philosophy at Melbourne and Oxford University, so we can expect a very deep discussion. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Kat. It's a great pleasure to be here. Well, it would be anyway, but any excuse to get away from Canberra, -4 degrees, spend an evening in Sydney is always welcome. So, yeah, look, this is one of my favourite topics in the whole world, and I could bang on about it all evening, so just don't let me go on for too long. What I'll try and do is to try and sketch a kind of a framework for thinking about these things. Hang on, I just have to take my watch off. Otherwise I really will talk all evening.
Oh, that's right, I'll stop.
What I want to do is kind of sketch a framework within which we ought to think about all the detailed issues. There's an awful lot of detailed issues out there at the moment, from what's happening on people's phone and so on, to what the hell Scott Morrison is going to be saying in Osaka to Donald Trump tonight and to Xi Jinping the next day. But what I want to do is to step back half a step from the day-to-day dramas and say, well, what's going on here? Why are we in this predicament? And so to try and put a bit of a framework around. So, start making a kind of obvious but important point. And that is that, although Donald Trump was being ironic, he was right actually. We are a lucky country. And one way in which we've been lucky is that the world has worked very well for us. We are a prosperous and secure country, and one of the reasons for that is that the world in which, and if you compare us with other countries, a lot of other countries around the world, the way the world has been set up has given us a lot of opportunities for prosperity and has left us pretty secure. And we do tend to take that for granted. We take it for granted that we live in an international setting in which we can operate pretty effectively. And I guess what's striking about this topic, and I think our topic for tonight was, the China anxiety or something, is that we are now more anxious about this. I think there's more anxiety in Australia about the rise of China, the way that China relates to the United States, the way Australia positions itself in relation to a powerful China, what that means for our relations with the United States. I think there's more anxiety about that more broadly than there's been on any foreign policy issue, except periodically when we decide to go to war with the United States in the Middle East. And so in terms of Australia's position in Asia, in terms of the fundamental things that affect Australia's prosperity and security, in other words, in terms of things that are of interest not just to people who follow foreign policy, but affect the lives of every Australian, I think we've got a level of anxiety at the moment that we haven't seen possibly since the dark days of the Cold War, or the second wave of the dark days of the Cold War in the early 1980s, when anxiety about nuclear war became such a significant part of our political and public debate. So it seems to me there's good reason why we're anxious. It's correct that we should be anxious about this. And to understand why we should be anxious, we have to start by just stepping back a bit and thinking about China and its rise. One of the problems with this is we've all been talking about China's rise for so long. We've got so used to the idea that China is rising that we've sort of over-familiarised ourselves with something which is in fact truly remarkable. In the past 40 years, since 1979 in fact, China has engineered the largest growth in, largest shift in wealth and power, biggest growth in any country's economy that we've ever seen in history. There's never been anything like it. Lots of countries in history before have grown, or a few countries in history before have grown as fast as China has grown over the last 40 years. But no country as big as China has grown that fast. So the net increase, the shift in the distribution of wealth has been literally unprecedented. And that's impressive by itself, but in particular in Asia, it is the first Asian power since China's own power was eclipsed by the rising West in the early 19th century. It's the first Asian power to end up more powerful than Britain or America. And so it's literally true to say, actually two things. The first is that we've never seen an Asian country as powerful as China is today, at least not since this continent was settled by Europeans. And we've actually, on some levels, never seen any country as powerful as China seems likely to become. And one way of just expressing that is to look at the figures that the Australian Treasury provided to the Foreign Affairs Department when the Foreign Affairs Department published its Foreign Policy White Paper at the end of 2017, where they estimated that in 2030, which is just 11 years from now, China's economy would be $42 trillion, that's GDP, in purchasing power parity terms, and America's would be 24. I'll say that again, 42 to 24. It's sorry?
11 years.
In 11 years' time. And that's the Treasury. I mean, I'm pretty bullish about China, so I rang up some of my old mates in Treasury and said, really? You know, that was a bit more than I expected. I would have expected maybe 32 rather than 42. And they came and said, oh yeah, no, we did all the sums, we factored all the stuff you hear, which is true about China's demographic problems, and it's a huge debt and all of that. It's got lots of problems, but right at the heart of it, it's just a big fundamental economic fact. They will have, notwithstanding the demographic problems, the largest workforce by miles, except for India. And India's, we might talk about India later, I'll get into that now. And they have a very robust basis for not unwavering, but over the longer term, consistent economic growth, fast enough to drive them to the point where their economy is within a time frame which is very, very soon, nearest, damn it, twice the size of America's. Now, people in America, people in Australia, if they don't keep on saying, oh, well, America is the biggest economy in the world. No, that's no longer true. So we keep on thinking, oh yes, we know about China's rise. We don't really realise just what a big thing it is. It's the biggest shift in distribution of wealth and power in human history. And it's worth making the point that that has a very particular significance in Asia, because the Asia we know, the Asia in which Australia was settled by Europeans, the Asia in which this society on this continent has thought about making its way since, roughly speaking, the end of the Second World War, when we started thinking about Asia as our, home and destiny, was an Asia which was dominated by the West. And the reason it was dominated by the West was because the West had more power. And it had more power. This sounds a bit oversimplified, but I think actually it's simple, but it's not oversimple. Had more power because it had more money. World's biggest economy. And so it overturns the whole idea that Australia's future in Asia can be assured because Asia can be made safe for us by Western powers that share our values and share our interests and so on. And so the vision we have of ourselves as a lucky country has been very much based on some assumptions about the West's place in Asia, which have been true actually since 1789. Ever since 1789, except you could say for the months between the attack on Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway, which was the 4th of June 1942. So except for those 7 months, every month since January 1789, either Britain or America has been the world's biggest economy, the world's strongest maritime power, the dominant strategic power in Asia, and our best mates. And we just think, oh, that's normal. No, it's not. It's just a weird historical fluke, which is not without some negatives, I admit, but on balance worked very well for us. So, this is going to change not just our view of Asia and how we make our way in Asia, but it's also, of course, going to change our view of ourselves. Because our view of ourselves as a country is so deeply tied up with all of that. Now, it's been tempting for people to think, oh, this can't be real, that somehow it can't be right, it can't be natural that China ends up with a bigger economy than the United States. And so there's been a very strong tendency, remains a strong tendency, to think that somehow this is just going to go away, that China's bubble will burst, that something will happen, something will go wrong in China, or maybe something will go right in the United States, and it will all be reversed, and somehow America will get back to where it belongs, and the Chinese will be, not to put too fine a point on it, put back in their place. Well, it's worth making point. China has lots and lots of problems. We might come back to those in the question time. We should be clear, I don't, as Kat's introduction suggested, I don't actually regard myself as a China expert. I don't speak Chinese. I don't, tell my friends at ANU and colleagues at ANU are very deep China experts. I'm not one of them. But even I can tell you that China has lots and lots of problems. Economic problems, demographic problems, political problems, ecological problems, and it's going to be a hell of a ride. It's going to be a hell of a ride in China in the next few decades. But I just make this point: the chance of those problems, yet separately or together, producing a really fundamental shift in the new distribution of power that is reversing what's happened in the last 4 decades and returning China to its, as they probably see in Washington, its rightful place down there rather than up there, is very low indeed. The only prudent expectation is that even if China goes through some pretty difficult patches, it will end up maybe a bit later or a bit slower than those Treasury figures suggested as the world's biggest economy, and therefore fundamentally more powerful than any Asian country that we've ever encountered before. And so there's no good just wishing this will go away. We've got to ask ourselves, well, what does it mean? And I think myself, the best way to think about that is to start with a little bit of International Relations 101. But don't worry, there's no exam at the end. How the world works, how countries interact with one another, what they have to do to get to stay secure and to build their prosperity and so on. How the world works depends on how the strong countries want it to work. It's a gloomy conclusion, but I think the historians bear it out. And in particular, it depends on how they agree between themselves, how the strongest powers agree between themselves that they want it to work. Now, this sort of contingent fact has been hidden from us for the last 30 years, which remember is now a generation. Because it is 30 years since the Berlin Wall came down. Most of you, I think, are old enough to remember that. None of my students are. And so, for 30 years, which is quite a long time in the way in which our views of these things evolve, for 30 years we've lived in a world, or at least we've thought we've lived in a world, where great powers, world's strongest states didn't disagree about the way the world worked. They all agreed, and they basically all agreed with Washington. Now, that, I never really bought that argument, I'm going to say, but it's certainly one of the things that's happened in the last year or two, literally, is that people have started to understand that's not so. We've re-recognised that the way major powers relate to one another the way the strongest powers relate to one another, is fundamental to the way the whole system works, including the way the system works for middle powers and smaller powers like Australia. And the way in which those deals that the great powers do work is very dependent, and how long they last is very dependent on the distribution of power between them. So when power shifts, relationships between major powers change. Now this is an old story, there's a story about what happened in the years before World War I and so on. But it's important, the point to recognise here is that what we're seeing unfold in Asia at the moment, as China's power grows relative to America's, is an absolutely quintessential example of a shift in the distribution of power, producing a shift in the way in which the order works and the kinds of agreements, the understandings that great powers have about their relations with one another, or rather a breakdown in those understandings, and the need to reforge another one. What we're seeing right now, what's happening around us, what actually Trump and Xi are doing when they sit down over dinner or whatever it is they have in Osaka in the next day or two, is trying to negotiate, I mean that in the broadest sense, what kind of new relationship they're going to have at a time when China's economy is not 1/20th the size of America's, as it was before 1979, but almost twice the size of America's. And you better believe it's going to be a different relationship. Now this process is often violent, very often through history, as a rising power seeks to expand its influence in the international system at the expense of an established power. They end up going to war with one another again, and that's a sort of World War II story. There's lots of examples of that through history. A lot of European history has been reflected that way. But I'm just here to say the process is, the fact that it leads to war, the idea that it leads to war is inevitable, I don't think is right. There's no reason to believe that a war between the US and China is inevitable. But what is inevitable is a change in the order. What is inevitable is the way in which the United States and China relate to one another and their relative influence. And what is inevitable, or as near as inevitable as you can get in human affairs, is that China is going to end up being more influential, much more influential in Asia than we have ever known it before. So that raises a really big question. What does China want? Well, I mean, at one level, the important answer is we don't know, and we better recognise that as a great mystery. And one of the reasons we don't know is that they don't know. They're making it up as they go along. I mean, countries always do. It may be that there are some, people in the Chinese leadership compound in Zhongnanhai, in the middle of Beijing, who have a kind of somewhere in a locked safe somewhere, there's a little folder saying, China's grand plan to rule the world. But the truth is, they are facing an extremely complex transition. They're pushing hard for everything they can get. They've got no idea what they're going to be able to get away with and what they're not going to be able to get away with. So they're making it up as they go along. And therefore we have to be very open-minded in not trying to leap to conclusions about exactly where they're headed when they don't know. However, having said that, I am going to leap to some conclusions, or at least I'm going to offer some hypotheses about what it is that China might be after. Because it's pretty important for us in thinking about what China's great power and influence means, to know what it is they want to do with it. The first is they want to make sure that the international order works in such a way that it allows them to keep growing. Now this used to be a bit of a cinch, because when America was the dominant power in Asia, as it has been for so long, America certainly did, as the Americans would claim and as the Chinese would acknowledge, manage the regional affairs in ways that did allow China to keep growing. In fact, you can say that it was the United States' willingness to support China's economic growth, which was one of the necessary conditions, not sufficient, but one of the necessary conditions for China to do what it's done. But now that's changed. What's very clearly coming out of Washington today is a desire to use Washington's power and influence in the international system to slow down, or even to stop, or even, if you ask John Bolton, to reverse China's growth. Now, China is certainly going to want to change that. The second is that it's going to be looking for an international system in which it has a much bigger say globally. Now, I'm not one of those who thinks that China wants to rule the world. A friend of mine sold 500,000 copies of a book called When China Rules the World. and you can't argue with that. but it's not true. I don't think China will rule the world. I don't think it's going to be very powerful. It won't be that powerful. But the real point is, I don't think there's evidence that the serious people in China want or expect to rule the world. What they do want to expect is that at the global level, when global issues are on the table, they are at least the equal of any of the others at the table, that they're not subordinate to anybody else. But the third point is that I think they do want to be the primary power in East Asia. In East Asia and the Western Pacific. Now, if I had a map here, I'd wave my hand, but roughly speaking, it's all of that stuff from Japan, not including Russia, from Japan all the way down through Southeast Asia to Australia and New Zealand and now down to the South Pacific. There's an important point there which I won't expand on further, but we might want to come back to. Is I don't think they want to be the dominant power in the Indian Ocean and South Asia, which is important and interesting, but I do think they want to be the primary power. By primary power, what do I mean by that? That would be a long story in itself, but they want to take over from the United States. The United States has been the primary power in the Western Pacific since, well, pick a date, some would say 1899 when they picked up the Philippines, as at very least since 1945. And the Chinese want to take America's place to play that role. Now, the question we know, if we was living in Europe, we think that's an interesting academic proposition, but here that's different. That means we are part of China's of the sphere of influence that China aspires to establish. So it's terribly important to us to ask, well, what does that mean? What kind of sphere of influence is that going to be? And to sort of define the range of possibilities, and again, we don't know, the Chinese are making this up, but at one end of the range of possibilities is the kind of sphere of influence that Joseph Stalin established in Eastern Europe, for example. Sort of Stalinist model. That's the extreme version, where the political system is imposed on you, when the commissars from Beijing, in this case, are installed in each of your ministries, where the entire fabric of domestic politics and economics is dictated from elsewhere. That's a very gloomy model. That's a model we want to avoid. The other model is what I call the Monroe model, after the US president who enunciated the Monroe Doctrine, America's Monroe Doctrine in 1824, under which America established a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, which it still maintains, remains the foundation of American foreign policy, that America is the primary power in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the way America has exercised that, really, for, what is it now, quite close on 200 years, has been much gentler than the Joe Stalin model. There aren't American comment, well, most of the time it's been much gentler than the Joe Stalin model. There aren't American commissars in the ministries or whatever. But it's not to say that America's hand is very light. There are a few clear principles in the Western Hemisphere, boundaries that Washington sets, and in the end Washington says, you guys can run your own countries, but if there's something that really affects us, we will expect you to listen to us, and we will certainly not tolerate any other outside power being more influential over you than we are. And so I think we'll be lucky if China's touch is as light as the Monroe touch in the Western Hemisphere. If it succeeds in achieving its objectives and becoming the primary power. And we might ask, well, how bad would that be? You might say we couldn't tolerate the Stalin model, but could we tolerate the Monroe model? We'd be sort of the Argentina in that model, if you know what I mean. It's not like we're in Canada or Mexico, we're not right next door. That's Japan or Vietnam. We're a lot much further away. But still, it would be very different. It would be very uncomfortable in all kinds of ways. It's something we need, and it would be very demanding for us as to how to manage it. So the big question for us is, well, how do we feel about that kind of prospect? And more to the point, what are we prepared to do to stop it? So this is where America comes in. Because so far, Australian governments, and I think more broadly Australian opinion, has relied on America to deal with this problem for us. by presuming that somehow America will just stop China doing this, prevent China becoming the dominant power in Asia. And the phrase which has become, until very recently, although I think maybe it actually made a reappearance in Scott Morrison's speech of yesterday, the phrase that's come to characterise Australian attitudes on this issue on both sides of politics, I might say, is we don't have to choose between America and China. That phrase rings like a bell or a mantra through policy statements on both sides of politics. And if you unpack it, it's pretty clear what it means. We don't have to choose between America and China, because America and China won't be strategic rivals, because the Americans will stop China challenging the United States and preserve its leadership in Asia. And for the reasons I've sketched, I don't think that's right. In other words, we've been in denial, our governments and our political leadership has been in denial about the seriousness of the challenge that China poses. And the problem with that in particular is that Americans have been in denial too. When Barack Obama came to our parliament, as it happens, in November 2011 and declared his pivot to Asia, which was all about finding a response to China's, back then, increasingly challenging conduct, he presupposed that the Chinese would back off without pushing. That is, all Obama had to do was to give a big speech in Canberra saying America's going to remain the dominant power in Asia, and that's pretty much what he said. And then the American Chinese would say, oops, sorry, didn't mean to offend, and back off. And I spent a lot of time talking to Americans in Washington about the pivot before and after the speech was given, and I kept on coming across them saying, you're just overestimating China, and you just got to understand that, as one senior American official said to me, the Chinese need us more than we need them, and they're not going to dig us around. Well, Chinese have spent a fair bit of time and energy over the last intervening 8 years proving that that's not the case. And of course now Americans are woken up to that. What we've seen in the last couple of years, in fact quite precisely you can say since the National Security Strategy of the Trump administration published in December 2017, is their recognition that they are going to have to push, that China won't just back off in the face of a stern speech from Barack Obama. And there's a new resolve in Washington to push back hard. They talk about a new Cold War, and I think they mean it. The trouble is they think they mean it. But they don't, I think, have any idea yet how hard they're going to have to push back, because they still underestimate China's power. Their aim is to restore US primacy, to take things back to the way they were, and they think that if they push China moderately hard, the Chinese will have no alternative but to back off. And that's the really dangerous thing. That's what makes the present situation so worrying from a strategic point of view. That in a contest like this, we saw this, you can use the 1914 analogy here, when as the US and China confront one another in Asia, neither side wants a conflict. But both sides want to achieve their objectives. America wants to remain the dominant power, China wants to become the dominant power. Both sides believe they can achieve their objectives without going to war, because they think the other side will back off. And if one side or the other's right, then that's fine. We'll get a change in order, but we won't have a conflict. But if they're both wrong, if I think you're going to back off and you think I'm going to back off, then neither of us backs off. So even though neither of us wants a war, we both find ourselves in a position where we do have to either push forward into the conflict or step back and admit defeat. That's actually what happened in the last week of July 1914. Nobody wanted a war in 1914. But everybody believed everybody else would back off so they could get what they wanted without a war. So this is, I don't want to be too gloomy about this. And again, as I said before, I don't regard war as inevitable by any means. But this is how wars happen. And it's worth making the point that if the war happens, America won't win it. They won't lose it, but they won't win it. So you'll end up with a stalemate. And once you have a stalemate, the stalemate looks like a loss to both sides, and so both sides have an inclination to escalate. And one factor here, although I wouldn't overstate it, but I do think we have to recognise that there is a real risk of any conflict between the US and China over an issue like Taiwan turning into a nuclear exchange. So this is a very, the good news is that the Americans are waking up to how serious China's challenge is. The bad news is they still radically underestimate how serious and dangerous that is. They're still expecting the Chinese to back off. And the other point, of course, is that managing these things requires very subtle and sophisticated decision making. And you'll see the problem there. It's just sort of funny, but actually it's sort of tragic too. This sounds like a truism, but it's important for those of us old enough to remember during the Cold War how worried we were about a nuclear exchange, and to recognise that nothing fundamental has changed. I mean, yes, the number of warheads is lower. Oh, great, it's only 5,000. I mean, it's very, very dangerous. So, now, there is a model in which the United States stays engaged in Asia, doesn't end up being drawn into a war with China, and does end up continuing to play a significant role. But it's a world in which America makes significant concessions to China, accommodates China, steps back and gives China some of the space, but doesn't just abandon the region and let China dominate it. And for a long time I've argued that that's the best outcome, or at least the least bad outcome, and the one Australia should be working towards. I'm now less confident than I never thought it was a very likely outcome, I just thought it was the one we should work towards. I'm now not sure that it's really possible, because it seems to me that America's position is now so much stronger and China's is so much, America's position is so much weaker and China's is so much stronger. So that leads us to a much deeper question, and that is the most likely outcome we face, I think, is that the United States will in fact withdraw. The reason I say that is, although lots of people in Washington are eager for this new Cold War, I don't think Donald Trump himself is, I don't think the Democrats are, and I don't think American voters are. I see no evidence that the American voters are willing to bear the burdens and pay the price for containing China's bids in Asia, and that means that we're likely to end up, most likely outcome, is that we'll end up with the Chinese succeeding in their objective and becoming the primary power in Asia with all of the uncertainties I sketched before. So just very quickly to finish up, to ask, well, what does that mean for Australia? There are two views, roughly speaking, or at least you can characterise the debate in two ways. There's the dragon slayers and the pandarkers. Some people say it's a complete disaster. Clive Hamilton will be prominent in this field, and he's made some very important points. And some people say, no, we don't really have to worry, it's not that bad. The first point I'd make is, and the reason for the anxieties that I think many of us are facing, is that it's clear that neither the government or the opposition really has any idea how to handle this. And so we have to, so to speak, think this one through for ourselves. There's a question about what China would want of us if it becomes the leading power in Asia. What kind of influence would it want to exercise over us, and how would it do it? And I think there's some interesting judgments we can make about that, including the extent to which it would want to interfere in our internal affairs. There's a question as to whether it could threaten our economic well-being by trying to pressure us economically. There's a question about how far it would want to threaten our political independence by seeking to influence or change our political institutions, and so on. And there is the question, which is, I think, pretty remote but still significant, certainly significant for one of my principal concerns, which is whether China could conceivably threaten us militarily. I don't think that's particularly likely, but I think it's a lot less unlikely than it would have been under the old order. So what should we do? I think, that's what we should discuss when I stop talking, but there's a few points we can make. The first is we need to just get real about it, to recognise the magnitude of the challenge that the old order in Asia faces, and how unlikely it is that we're going to end up back in the old US-led order that, for all its faults and discomforts, worked so well for us. The second is that we shouldn't panic. There's a bit of a tendency to think, oh, it's a complete disaster. One way to think about that is that we're actually moving into a situation which is very far from being uncommon in the world. We think it's normal for Australia to enjoy a very high level of support from the world's most powerful state, first Britain and America. Actually, most countries, most small and middle powers don't have that. They just go through life, try and make the best they can, trying to fend off the various great powers that are trying to impose pressures on them, And so if you look back in history, there's an awful lot of examples of small and middle powers making their way in the world without a great and powerful friend, and there's some pretty big countries around them trying to push them around. So we shouldn't panic about this, but we should recognise that it's going to be very different. And the third is we should work to understand how international power works. And I don't think we do that very well because we don't have much experience of it. And the fourth is we should try and understand China a lot better. Jeff and I were talking before about how few of us speak Chinese, including me, how little we understand what's going on in China, and how easy it is to adopt the sort of, simplistic images, both negative and positive. The booming skyscrapers of Shanghai on the one hand, or the internment camps of Xinjiang on the other. They're both real, but there's a lot of China in between them. And the second last point I'd mention is that we do need to remember that whatever else happens, the 1.2 million Australians, as I believe the figure is now, is of Chinese extraction and origin. We have to remember they are a massive asset in this process and not a liability. And some of what's disturbed me about some of the way we've seen this discussion developing over the last year or so has not, I think, reflected that. The very last point I'd make is that I do think we also have to think about what it means for our defence posture. So amongst all these other things, and there's a lot more to it than defence, but the fact is that one of the things that's happened is that we can no longer assume, if we ever could, that America would automatically be there to defend us if we did face a military threat from China or from any other major power. And that requires us to think very carefully about our own defence capabilities going over the next couple of decades. I'll finish there.